Hello, all you scaredy cats and kittens, and welcome to the Two Scaredy Cats podcast, where we talk about all things strange, unusual, and paranormal. We're your hostess with the mostest. I'm Stacy, and well, Kara's not with us today. She is busy getting ready for the wedding. She just got back from a trip to Phoenix for her sister-in-law who just got married earlier this week, and they need to get ready for their music for the wedding, so she could not be on with us today, but I am here with you, and thank you for hanging out with me today. Hopefully it will live up to what we're used to doing. So today I am going to be talking about a couple of stories that are from the UK. So I guess since it's just me today, I'll go ahead and get started here, but I would like to welcome all of our new listeners and say hello to all of our listeners that have been listening to us for quite a while now. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the podcast today. First up, we have folklore from the UK called Jenny Greenteeth. Now, Jenny is a malevolent water hag with green molten skin, long hair, and sharp pointy teeth. She is said to be found lurking beneath beds of duckweed in ponds, canals, or gravel pits. She is known to attempt to drown children or the elderly that stray too close to her watery homes, dragging them into the murky water and out of sight. Once she has you in the water, she will proceed to drown you, and then after she's drowned you, she will start to eat you. Yes, I know, that's kind of yuck. But yeah, so she likes to eat people. Other stories from the area suggest that she would perch from tree branches at night and near her watery home to catch unsuspecting victims. She is similar to the Scottish Kelpie in that, they have very sharp, jagged teeth and they like to eat people. Jenny is associated with bodies of water covered in duckweed. Her name is actually an old-fashioned term used to describe duckweed, which is the common water plant that you can find over in England in ponds and stuff. Duckweed will form a dense cover over a pond and a creek, and when you look at it, it looks like solid ground that you can walk on, but when you attempt to walk on it, you soon realize that it basically is just a covering over the water. This was the reason why people used the Jenny Greenteeth was to scare little children so they wouldn't get too close to the water, so they wouldn't fall in and drown, because once you get sucked into the water with the duckweed on it, and you get pulled down underneath, it's really hard for people to get out of it because it's so thick and it just kind of like weighs you down. So anyway, they would use this to scare little children, and so they came up with the name of Jenny Greenteeth. So in 2018, Jenny Greenteeth returned as a ghost that haunts the St. James Cemetery in England. There have been numerous sightings of paranormal activity in the cemetery. There's one particular sighting that happened in 2018 where an Australian tourist was in this particular cemetery, and she was looking around and she happened to be taking some photos, and she captured what she claims to be a photo of Jenny's Greenteeth. The photo shows a long-haired figure standing in a part of the cemetery that is now covered by weeds and nettles. So it was like really hard for somebody to have gotten to where the image of the person that you can see in the photo. If you also look at the photo, which we will have this up on our Instagram page, a picture of this, you'll notice that the person that you see looks like you can kind of see through them. They're not solid. So that's why people think it's an actual picture of Jenny Greenteeth. But anyway, Jenny Greenteeth is a term or a folklore that is used all over the UK, in Scotland and in England both, as a way to keep children and older people away from going off near ponds and stuff so they don't drown. Okay, so the second story that I have today comes from Scotland. And this one is a really interesting, it's a true crime story. It deals with body snatchers, serial killers, all that kind of goody stuff that we like. And the funniest and the interesting thing in this story, there's several interesting things, but one of the more interesting things in this story is that when the guys that we're going to be talking about were caught, they were caught on Halloween, actually, in 1828. So, anyway, why don't you sit back and we'll get started with our second story, which is called The Burke and Hare Murders. Now, Burke and Hare were two Irish immigrants who had become Edinburgh's most notorious serial killers. They murdered at least 16 people between the years of 1827 and 1828. They killed the lonely and the destitute of Edinburgh society, selling their bodies to a Dr. Knox, who used them for a dissection at his anatomy school in the Surgeons' Square in Edinburgh. The pair were caught on All Hallows' Eve in 1828. So Burke and Hare claim that they are not body snatchers. In his official confession, Burke declared to the police that neither him nor Hare had never dug up dead bodies and sold them. They killed their victims first, and then they sold them. So I guess there's a big difference between killing your victim and digging them up out of the grave. But anyway, during this particular time in the UK and in England, and that it was okay for people to bring in dead bodies to like the hospitals and that, for them to use in anatomy classes and stuff to dissect them. And they never questioned where you got them from, which I think is kind of crazy that, back then you could just, roll up with a dead body and it'd be like, oh, sure, here's some money. Thanks for bringing me the body that we can cut up in class. But that's the way they did things back then. So, William Burke was born around 1792 in Ireland to a Catholic family. He then later moved to Scotland in 1818 to work as a knave on the Union Canal. Now, William Hare was in Newer County, Doughton, in Ireland, and his exact birth date remains unknown. In fact, a lot of information about him is kind of very, we don't know a lot about him. It's very sketchy. So he arrived in Scotland also to work as a knave out at the Union Canal in 1818, and he was working there the same years that Burke was. They worked together there for, not together, but they were like in the same area working on the same stuff for 4 years. So these two had very different personalities, yet they were like, the best of friends and thick as thieves, as they like to say. Hare was an immoral, violent, uncouth, and quarrelsome person, where Burke was very polite. He was an expert with a spade. He was a pleasant companion and just pleasant to be around in general. Both of these gentlemen were married and met their wives once they got to Scotland. Despite both of them working on the Union Canal, they did not actually meet until Burke rented a room in Hare's lodging house on Tanner's Close in Edinburgh. And that's where these two started getting into trouble together. So Burke and Hare started murdering people after they sold their first victim, Old Donald, to Dr. Knox when he died and owed them £4 in rent money. Now, it is said that they ended up selling Old Donald to Dr. Knox for £7, so they actually made a profit on it. And Old Donald, by the way, was an army pensioner, and he died of natural causes. So he was the only one out of all of them that they did not kill. So once, he killed over and died, they were like, hey, he owes us money. So they went and they brought his body to Dr. Knox for him to use, cutting him up for his anatomy class. So realizing that good money could be made from selling corpses, Burke and Hare embarked on a 10-month murder spree, making over £120 before being caught on Halloween of 1828. Almost all the murders that they committed took place at the Hare's lodging home in Tanner's Close, or at Burke's house a few streets away. In total, they killed 16 people. Now, most of the killings took place at Hare's place in Tanner's Close, but they had an argument and while Burke was on vacation. So Burke got mad, and when he came back, they actually ended up killing a couple people over at Burke's cousin's house where he was staying at, after him and Hare got into their fight and had like a little tiny bit of a falling out. So originally Burke and Hare were going to sell their cadavers to Professor Monroe, who was, I guess, a very popular professor at the time that a lot of people brought their corpses to be dissected by him for his anatomy classes. But they didn't know where or how to get the body to him. So they were roaming around in a part of town called the medical part of town, I guess, back then. And when they were roaming around there, they ran into a medical student who told them where to go. And they thought they were going to Professor Monroe, but they ended up going to Dr. Knox because the student was a student of Dr. Knox, and he knew that they had a cadaver and that they needed bodies to dissect. So anyway, they ended up delivering the body to Dr. Robert Knox. And so that's where they started taking them to, was there. So Burke and Hale's last victim was Mary Margaret Docherty, or the old woman. And by this time, people were starting to get a little suspicious of where Burke and Hare were getting all this money from, because, they were obviously spending a lot of money, and their life weren't very rich to begin with, and now all of a sudden they have all this money. And people were starting to wonder about tenants from Hare's boarding house who were leaving mysteriously. Like, they would say, oh, that person left to go back to wherever, and people were starting to question that. So Mary was killed on October 31st, 1828, and her body was hidden under a pile of straw in the Burke's bedroom at his house. After they got her drunk, she suffocated by a method now referred to as Burking, which is when you suffocate someone by placing a hand over the nose and the mouth of the victim. So Mary was lured to their house and plied with liquor, giving a bunch of whiskey, and during her drunken stupor, she ended up passing out. So while she was laying unconscious on the floor, they murdered her by placing a hand over her nose and mouth. So one of them put their hand over her nose and mouth, and the other one held her down or kind of leaned on her chest so that she couldn't get any air, and she died. So after that, she was stripped of her clothes and folded in half and hidden under the pile of straw. Now, Docherty was later discovered by Burke's lodger named Anne Gray when she returned back from breakfast. And she happened to run into Burke's wife on the steps. She saw the dead body and she started screaming and freaking out. And Burke's wife offered her some money for her to be quiet about what she saw. Well, Anne didn't want to have anything to do with that, and she started screaming, and the next thing you know, one of the neighbors ended up calling the police, and the police came. So if it hadn't been for the Burke's strange behavior, and by this I mean that he was splashing whiskey around the room to help mask the odors that he felt were in the room. And when he was doing this, and his wife had tried to silence, Mr. and Mrs. Gray about what they may or may not have seen, then they might not have gotten away with the murder. Of course, the bloodstained sheets that were found on the bed in the house was enough to raise suspicion with the police, and they had Mr. and Mrs. Burke taken into custody. Hare was caught when they found Mary Docherty's body bound up in a tea chest near Surgeon Square, and that's the square I was telling you about where, like all the hospitals in the area were. Interestingly enough, only William Burke was ever hanged for the murders committed by him and Hare. William Hare was given immunity after turning in the king's evidence. His whereabouts after Burke was hanged are not known. Both the wives disappeared after the husbands, were turned in, and after William Burke was hanged, they both left. It's said that William's wife, actually, she left on a ship and went back. She went to like Paris or somewhere, and people say that they saw her years later being like a handmaid or something in one of the houses there. But nobody can really confirm nor deny that. So that's the story of Burke and Hare and their murderous rampage that lasted for a year, and all the people that they killed just so they could make money off their bodies. I mean, in total, they made like 110 pounds, which back then was like a lot of money, I would assume. It's just crazy that they lasted as long as they did, killing all these people. Now, their take on the whole thing is they were helping society by taking care of the more, downtrodden people in Edinburgh society, and, people that were the poorer people. They thought they were helping society out by taking care of them and killing them. So let's see what else. If you have not had the opportunity or chance to, you should really see Rosemary's Baby has been playing on AMC a lot recently. And the particular one, they're airing the whole movie, but then afterwards they have a really cool thing where they talk about behind the scenes and what happened during the making of the movie. And they talk about all the crazy stuff that went on while they were making Rosemary's Baby, which I had never heard of half the stuff, which I thought was fascinating. And there was talk that they were having like issues on set with certain, things happening, like, people getting really sick, bad things happening, kind of like on the set of The Exorcist. But here's the crazy thing. Roman Polanski, and if you don't know this, was actually directed Rosemary's Baby. Now, Roman Polanski was killed by Manson and his gang. And there's like a lot of, it's crazy because that whole movie was all about witchcraft and all that. When he was making the movie, he was actually talking with Anton LaVey, who was a Satanist and had written the Satanic Bible. And he was a technical advisor on the film for Polanski, to find out, how like rituals and stuff would have been done for the movie to make it look more realistic. So it was kind of crazy, all these ties that Polanski had to all these people that were kind of like, involved with things that had to do with, the devil and all that, and about how, he had such bad luck. And his wife, Sharon Tate, was killed by the Charlie Manson family. And Polanski later on was arrested 8 years after Sharon Tate's death for the sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl. And several months after his arrest, he ended up fleeing the United States before his sentence had even been completed, and he has never returned to the United States since then. It's just pretty crazy, but it was really cool to watch the after thing where they talked about some of the stuff that happened and how they tied it all together, to the movie and stuff. It's pretty crazy. So if you have a chance, you should check that out, especially like while they're airing it during spooky season here. Don't forget, the Five Nights at Freddy's movies comes out next weekend. It's supposed to be really good. If you're like anything paranormal and you haven't listened to all of our podcasts yet, there's some really good ones out there. We talk about several ones that are related to movies. We have the one about the exorcism of Emily Rose. That's a good one. We talk about The Exorcist. We talked about that last time, not last week. We also talk about, there's another tie-in to, there's a couple more movies, I forget what they were, but that I all tie in. So you should really give it a listen if you're interested. Or the Burke and Hare murder that I talked about today. There's a lot of information on that. You can find that all over. It's really interesting. There's a couple of books out about it that you could read. There's a movie about them that you could watch. There's a couple of websites that are dedicated to them, and some of them go into like really like deep dive into what happened in each murder and detailing, how they lured them. A lot of the times they would lure their victims in with like alcohol or try and like befriend them in that. But for the most part, they were just like looking for sad, lonely people to prey upon, unfortunately. So that's all I have for the show this week, I guess. Kara will be back with me next time. Like I said, she's knee deep in wedding stuff right now, and she had to get all the music in for the DJ by like tomorrow. So she's working diligently on that with her fiance, hopefully, anyway. And I think that's all we have for this week. So if you enjoyed our podcast today, please make sure to like and follow us on Instagram. You can find more episodes of our podcast wherever you stream. And tune in 2 weeks for another exciting episode of the Two Scaredy Cats podcast. And don't forget, curiosity didn't kill these two scaredy cats.